The night I got promoted to senior architect at Halverson and Cross, my husband took me to this little Italian place we've been going to since our second date. The kind of restaurant where the owner knows your name and the candles are always slightly too melted, like they've been burning since before you arrived. We ordered the same thing we always did, the tagliatelle for me, the branzino for him, and when the champagne came, he reached across the table and held both my hands in his and said, "I always knew you'd get here. I'm the luckiest man alive." I believed him. God, I believed every single word. That was a Thursday. By Sunday, I didn't recognize the man I'd married. I need to back up a little, because the Sunday conversation didn't come out of nowhere. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that were already there, hairline fractures I'd been spackling over for 3 years of marriage. My mother-in-law had never made a secret of the fact that she thought her son had settled. She was a retired school principal from outside Columbus, the kind of woman who kept a mental ledger of every perceived slight and collected them like fine china. She once told me at Christmas in front of my husband that my apartment before we got married had been cozy, the way people say cozy when they mean small and sad. She called my job ambitious, which in her mouth sounded like a diagnosis. My husband. I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, even if he stopped acting like one, had always found reasons to dismiss her comments. That's just how she is. She means well. You're too sensitive. I loved him, so I let it go. I let a lot of things go. I was good at that. What I wasn't good at, apparently, was being a round peg in the square hole he'd quietly been carving out for me. The Sunday conversation started calmly. He came into the kitchen where I was prepping a grocery list and said he needed to talk to me. His face had that particular blankness he got when he'd already made up his mind about something and was just walking me through the announcement. I've learned to recognize it since then. At the time, I just thought he looked tired. His mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. She'd hidden it from both of us for months, apparently, managing on her own in her house 40 minutes north of us. She'd had a bad episode 2 weeks earlier, dropped her medication, couldn't get up off the bathroom floor for an hour before she called him. He'd been going up there on weekends since then without telling me, and I hadn't pushed because I thought he just needed space to process his mom getting older. I'm sorry, I told him. I'm so sorry, I mean that. What do we do? And that's when his face changed. That blankness shifted into something more deliberate, something rehearsed. He said his mother couldn't live alone anymore. He'd looked at options. A professional caregiver through an agency was anywhere from $4,000 to $7,000 a month out of pocket, which he decided was out of the question. An assisted living facility, he said, was warehousing her, and he couldn't do that to her. There was one solution that made sense. She needed to move in with us, into our house. The house we'd bought together 2 years ago. The one I'd spent 18 months renovating, repainting, and making into something I was actually proud of. I said okay. I said that was hard, but we could figure it out. We had the second bedroom. We'd need to convert my home office, but I could make something work. He seemed relieved. Too relieved, I realize now. The way someone is relieved when the hard part of a conversation is over. And that's when he said the rest of it. He said my commute was long. He said my hours were brutal, especially now with the new role. He said his mother was going to need real attention, the kind of attention that a part-time aide couldn't give, the kind only family could. He said, and this is the part I keep coming back to, the part that changed everything, he said. You're so nurturing, sweetheart. You're so good with people. She'd be so much better with you than with a stranger. I looked at him for a long time. I asked him what exactly he was saying. He said he thought I should leave Halverson and Cross. He said it the way you'd suggest changing your dinner reservation. Casual. Already decided. I want to tell you that I lost it. That I threw something. That I said every word I was thinking. But I didn't. I felt something go very quiet inside me. Not the quiet of surrender, but the quiet of a room before a storm, when even the air holds still. I looked at my husband's face, so calm, so certain, so completely convinced that I would eventually see the logic of what he was proposing, and something cold and clear settled into my chest. I smiled at him. Not a warm smile, not a relieved smile, the kind of smile that lives behind your back teeth. You might be right, I said. His shoulders dropped. He reached for my hand. I knew you'd understand. She needs us. This is what family does. I nodded, but I'd need something from you first. He was still in relief mode, so he said, of course, anything. What did I need? I took a breath. I told him if I was going to walk away from a career I'd spent a decade building, from a salary that, by the way, was nearly 20% higher than his at that point, I needed to know I was protected. I'd be giving up my income, my benefits, my professional identity, my retirement contributions, everything. I'd be completely financially dependent on him. What if something happened? What if, 5 years from now, things between us changed? I'd be a woman in her early 30s with a gap in her resume and no savings of her own. I need you to put the house in my name, I said. Sole ownership. Just the house. It's not about trust. It's about security. If I don't have a paycheck, I need to know I have a roof. The relief on his face curdled a little. I watched it happen. He said the house was ours. What was his was mine. We were married. I said, then it shouldn't be a problem to make that official on paper. I let my chin wobble, just slightly. I let my eyes go glassy. I said, you're asking me to trust you with my entire future. Can you trust me with one document? He said he needed to think about it. I said okay. And I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark with my mind running like a machine. He came to me 2 days later and said he'd do it. I moved quickly after that. I found a real estate attorney. Not through anyone he knew, a woman named Alice who had a small office in Westerville and a reputation for being meticulous. And I explained I needed a quitclaim deed transfer, processed as cleanly and quickly as possible. I told her a simplified version of the truth. I was leaving my job to become a caregiver, and I needed the security of the house being in my name before I handed in my notice. She didn't blink. She'd seen everything. While the paperwork moved through the county recorder's office, I kept going to work. I closed 2 projects. I had a quiet lunch with my managing partner, a woman I'd admired for years who listened to my whole situation over a bowl of soup and said without hesitation, "Don't quit. Renegotiate." We talked for 2 hours. When I left that lunch, I had a handshake agreement for a remote consulting arrangement that would let me work roughly 30 hours a week from home at an hourly rate that made my previous salary look modest. I didn't tell my husband any of this. His mother moved in on a Saturday in October. He drove up to get her while I stayed home and made the guest bedroom as comfortable as I could. Fresh linens, a nightstand lamp with a soft bulb, a little basket with her brand of lotion that I'd looked up online. I wanted to do right by her genuinely. Whatever I thought of her and her ledger of slights, she was sick, and that wasn't her fault. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She walked in on her husband's arm. She'd remarried after my father-in-law passed. A quiet man who waved from the car and said he'd let them get settled. And her eyes swept the living room the way a building inspector looks at new construction. She stopped at the entryway to the kitchen, looked at the open shelving I'd installed myself over the course of a very satisfying weekend, and said, "Well, that's a choice." I smiled. "It's one of my favorites in the house, actually." She made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement. I showed her the bedroom. She stood in the doorway and looked at the duvet, the lamp, the little basket, and said, "I assumed I'd have the larger room." She meant the master. She meant our room. I said, "This is the room we have for guests. We made it as comfortable as we could for you." My husband caught my eye from the hallway. His expression said, "Please, please just don't." I said, "Can I get you some tea?" She sat at the kitchen table while I made it, and she told me about her drive, her hip, the traffic on Route 36, and the fact that her doctor had told her she really should be sleeping on a firmer mattress. I nodded. I handed her the tea. I was very, very pleasant. I was so pleasant it was almost clinical. After she went to lie down, my husband cornered me in the kitchen and said I was being passive-aggressive. I said I was being a host. He said she needed to feel at home here. I said she is welcome here. I said she is welcome here as our guest. She is not the owner of this house, and that distinction matters. His eyes went to something careful. He said, The deed hasn't transferred yet, has it? I showed him the notification email from the county recorder's office on my phone. Filed and confirmed. The careful thing in his eyes went somewhere else entirely. The first real confrontation happened 3 days later. I was on a video call with a client, door closed, headphones on, 9 in the morning, when she opened my office door without knocking and stood in the doorway waiting for me to stop. I held up one finger and finished my sentence, said goodbye, and turned around. She said she needed me to drive her to the pharmacy. She'd run out of one of her medications. I said I could take her in an hour when my call block ended. She said she'd taken the last one this morning and she needed it today. I said I understood, and I could take her in an hour, or we could look at whether a delivery service could get it there faster. She said she didn't understand why this was complicated. I said it wasn't complicated. I had a work commitment until 10, and I would take her at 10. I asked if she wanted me to call the pharmacy to hold the prescription. She walked out without answering. When my husband got home that evening, she'd already talked to him. I heard it in his voice when he called me into the living room. The look on her face was the look of someone who has already won the argument in absentia. He said he thought we needed to talk about expectations. He said his mother had felt dismissed. I sat down. I said she came into my office without knocking while I was with a client and asked me to drop everything immediately. I offered to take her an hour later. That's not dismissal, that's a schedule. He said she was used to having people accommodate her. I said, I'm not people. I'm her daughter-in-law who gave up her office and rearranged her life. I have work, real work. Work that keeps the lights on. He said I was supposed to have quit. I said, and I will. Once I know this arrangement is actually going to work the way you said it would. We're 3 days in and I'm already being called out of a client meeting. He didn't have a great answer to that. He went to sit with his mother, and I went back to my office and I cried for about 10 minutes alone into my sleeve, because I was tired and I missed the version of this marriage that I'd believed in. Then I wiped my face and opened my laptop and sent 3 emails that needed sending. The appointment I'd scheduled for the following week was with a specialist in movement disorders at the Ohio State Wexner Medical Center, not her regular GP, who was a perfectly decent man but not equipped to manage Parkinson's progression. I'd made the referral myself, calling in a favor from a colleague whose husband was a neurologist. I told my husband it was important to get a proper baseline assessment before we built a care plan. He agreed. He thought this would validate everything he'd already decided. It did not validate everything he'd already decided. The specialist was a small, serious woman with reading glasses on a chain who asked my mother-in-law a battery of questions, watched her walk, tested her grip, tracked her eye movement, and spent an additional 20 minutes talking to me and my husband separately. My husband told the doctor his mother had good days and bad, was mostly managing, just needed a little extra support at home. I told the doctor the truth, the fall that hadn't been mentioned, the 2 weeks of unsteadiness we'd observed since she'd moved in, the medication she'd run out of because she'd lost track of the refill schedule, the night I'd heard her up at 2 in the morning and found her confused about where she was. I'd been keeping notes on my phone. I showed them to the doctor. The doctor sat us both down afterward and said my mother-in-law's Parkinson's was further progress than the initial assessment had indicated. She needed structured supervision for a minimum of 6 to 8 hours daily. She needed medication management by someone trained to do it. She needed physical therapy twice a week and occupational therapy once a week. She needed fall prevention equipment installed throughout the house, grab bars, threshold ramps, a shower chair, a medical alert system. Then the doctor looked at me directly and said, based on what you've described and the care needs I'm outlining, this exceeds what a family member without clinical training should be managing alone. The level of need here requires either a certified home health aide or placement in a memory and movement care facility. I don't say that to be harsh. I say it because trying to manage this without proper support is a health risk for both your mother-in-law and for you. My husband sat very still. His mother said she didn't see what all the fuss was about. The drive home was 23 minutes. No one spoke for 22 of them. Then my husband said I'd exaggerated things to the doctor. I said the doctor's assessment matched everything I'd documented. He said, you documented things? Like a case file? Like someone who was preparing to provide care and wanted to do it responsibly, I said. Unlike someone who made a massive decision about another person's life and health without a single conversation with a medical professional. He gripped the steering wheel. So what now? Now, I said, we find her appropriate care. We can't afford that. She might be able to. He turned to look at me at a red light. I'd asked my mother-in-law 2 weeks earlier to share some basic financial information so I could research benefits, Medicaid eligibility, veterans programs through her late first husband, framing it as helping her plan. She'd handed me a folder without looking at it very closely. In that folder was a fidelity statement, a pension summary from the Ohio State Teachers Retirement System, and a CD account at Fifth Third Bank. Altogether enough to fund quality memory and movement care for the next 10 to 12 years without touching a dollar of my husband's salary. She wasn't destitute. She'd simply never been asked to spend her own money. I didn't tell him all of that right then in the car. I just said, let me do some research. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table with my husband and my mother-in-law, and I laid out what I'd found. I did it calmly. I did it with a spreadsheet, because I'm an architect and spreadsheets are how I show people things they don't want to see. I showed them 3 licensed home health agencies in our area with certified aides experienced in Parkinson's care. I showed them 2 highly rated memory and movement care facilities within 30 minutes of us, both with excellent staff ratios and activities programming. I showed them the cost of each option alongside the financial summary I'd compiled from the folder she'd given me. My mother-in-law looked at her own financial information like it was something she'd never seen before. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe no one had ever made her look at it directly. My husband looked like the floor had opened under him. He said, "You were planning this." I said, "I've been planning a lot of things." I went to my bag and pulled out the folder I'd been carrying for 2 weeks. My consulting agreement, my new client roster, my projected income for the next 12 months, which was honestly a little dizzying to look at. I'm not quitting my job, I said. I'm not going to quit my job. I built this career one late night at a time for 10 years, and I'm not walking away from it because it was inconvenient for someone else's plan. I tried to accommodate what you asked. I listened, and I asked for something reasonable in return, and you agreed to it. So, the house is mine. I let that land. And as the person whose name is on this deed, I have to be honest with both of you. This isn't working. What I agreed to was to care for your mother. What I'm being asked to do is disappear, professionally, personally, financially, while also doing the work of a trained medical aid for a condition I'm not qualified to manage. That's not a caregiving arrangement. That's something else, and I won't do it. My mother-in-law started to speak. I held up a hand, gently. I don't think you're a bad person, I said, and I meant it. I think you're scared, and I think it came out in ways that were hard on everyone. I've had my feelings hurt by some of it, but that's not what this is about. This is about what's actually best for you. And what's actually best for you is Meadowbrook. I slid the brochure across the table. I toured it Tuesday. It's beautiful. The staff is incredible. They have a gardening program that I thought you might genuinely like, given your yard. She picked up the brochure. Her hands were shaking slightly, the Parkinson's not emotion, though maybe both. She didn't say anything. My husband said, quietly, "And what about us?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Is this it? Are you ending our marriage over this?" I said, "You asked me to give up everything I'd worked for so that you wouldn't have to make any hard choices. And when I found a way to protect myself from that, you called it a betrayal. I need you to think about what you actually want from a partner, because what you described isn't a partner, it's staff." He put his head in his hands. My mother-in-law was still looking at the brochure. She turned to the page with the garden. She traced the photograph with one finger. She moved into Meadowbrook 6 weeks later. It took longer than I planned. There was paperwork, a waiting list, a room that opened up when another resident transferred to a higher level of care. During those 6 weeks, we brought in a part-time certified aide through one of the agencies I'd found, a calm and competent woman who came 4 days a week and actually knew what she was doing. My mother-in-law resisted it for about 3 days and then decided she preferred AD's company to mine anyway, which was honestly a relief. My husband and I didn't talk about the future much during those weeks. We moved around each other carefully, like people sharing a kitchen after a fight. Neither of them has fully named yet. He watched me work. I think he hadn't actually understood before then what I did, the calls, the drawings, the client presentations, the problems I solved with a pencil and a site plan and a decade of knowing how buildings work. I think he'd understood that I had a job the way you understand that someone takes vitamins. You know it happens, you just don't really picture it. One night he stood in the doorway of my office and watched me for a moment and then said, "I didn't know it looked like that." I said, "Like what?" He said, "Like you love it." I didn't answer. I didn't know what to do with that yet. The day the movers came for his mother's things, I made coffee and stayed out of the way. She stopped in the kitchen doorway on her way out, leaning on the aide's arm, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not warm exactly, but something that wasn't the legikiba look either. She said, "The shells are actually nice, the open ones." I said, "Thank you, I built them myself." She nodded once, and then she left. The house was very quiet after that. My husband sat at the kitchen table for a long time without saying anything. I made him a cup of coffee too, and I sat across from him, and we just existed in the same room for a while without talking. He said eventually, "I think I thought that because my salary covered the mortgage, the house was more mine than yours. I know that's not legal or fair. I know it. I just think I felt it without realizing it." I said, "I know." He said, "And I think I thought that because you were better at managing people, managing logistics, managing everything, that meant you should. I took your competence as an invitation to opt out." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I need to be a better son, a real one, not one who outsources that to his wife." I didn't say anything. I just listened. He said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm just saying it out loud because I think I need to hear myself say it. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. We didn't fix it for a long time afterward. There were a lot of conversations, some of them ugly, most of them necessary. There was a couples counselor, a practical, no-nonsense woman who had a gift for asking the one question neither of us had thought to ask. There was a period of a few months where I genuinely didn't know if we'd make it. And I told myself that was okay, that I had my work and my house and my consulting income and I would be all right either way. We did make it. Not in the version of the marriage that existed before that Thursday dinner. Something different, more honest, more careful, more negotiated. He has a standing visit with his mother every Sunday at Meadowbrook. He brings her the lemon shortbread cookies she likes from the bakery near our house. He stays for 2 hours. He comes home and tells me what she said. It's more than he'd done for her when she was living 40 minutes away, and I think on some level he knows that. She's doing well at Meadowbrook, actually. Better than she was with us, honestly, which doesn't surprise me. She has a routine, and people who are trained to maintain it. She joined the gardening program. She's been teaching 2 of the aides to play bridge, which she describes as a community service. I finished a major residential project last spring. The biggest commission our firm had taken on in years. There's a photo of the completed building on my phone that I look at sometimes when I need to remember what it is I love about this work. It's just a building, someone else might say. Just glass and steel and a very specific allocation of space. But I know how many hours are in it, how many problems I solved to get there. How many times I sat at my desk at midnight working through a structural issue that wouldn't leave me alone until I'd found the right answer. I look at that photo and I think, this is what I would have given up. And then I close my phone and I go back to work. I've thought a lot about what I would have done differently. Not the big moves, the deed transfer, the consulting arrangement, the specialist appointment. Those I'd do again without blinking. But the smaller things. The years of letting comments slide, the habit of smoothing things over to keep the peace. The way I'd learned to make myself convenient so that everyone else could stay comfortable. Here's what I know now. The way people treat you is often a direct reflection of what you've taught them to expect. Not because you're weak and not because you deserve it, but because human beings are adaptive, and if someone learns that a certain behavior costs them nothing, they repeat it. My mother-in-law spent 3 years sharpening her opinions on me because I handed her the whetstone every time I smiled and changed the subject. My husband made the decision he made because he'd never once been asked to account for the math of our marriage. Who was carrying what? Who was carrying what? Who was sacrificing what? Who was quietly absorbing the costs so that life could run smoothly? That's not a judgment of them as people. It's just cause and effect. The way water finds the path of least resistance. What changed everything wasn't the quitclaim deed, it wasn't the spreadsheet or the specialists, or even the moment I sat them both down at the kitchen table. What changed everything was the moment I stopped trying to be convenient and started telling the truth about what I needed. That shift cost me a lot of sleep and more than a few tears into my sleeve at 10 o'clock at night. But it also gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd been slowly giving away. The sense that my work, my time, my professional identity actually mattered. Not because someone told me they did, because I acted like they did. I think about the version of myself that almost said yes, that almost handed in a resignation letter and picked up an apron and tried to make it work out of love and guilt and the fear of being seen as selfish. That woman would have been miserable. And here's the thing, my mother-in-law wouldn't have been well cared for either. Resentment is not a treatment plan. RDAs, the aide who came 4 days a week and actually knew what she was doing, gave my mother-in-law something I never could have: competence, patience, and a completely neutral relationship. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is admit you're not the right person for the job. There's a particular kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on performance reviews. It's not technical skill or strategic thinking. It's the ability to see clearly when your emotions are loudest. To look at a situation that feels like a crisis and ask, what is actually being asked of me here and is it reasonable? That question, asked calmly in the middle of my worst moment, saved me. It saved my career. It probably saved my marriage. Though that took longer. I still have the photo of that building on my phone. The one I finished last spring. I look at it when I need to remember what I'm made of. Not as a trophy, just as evidence that I showed up, that I did the work, that I didn't disappear. The choices that define us are rarely the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones. The moment you decide not to shrink, the moment you pick up the phone and call a lawyer instead of an apology, the moment you look at what you've built and decide it's worth protecting. That's the only revenge worth having.